So tonight we're going to have a look at this subject of Middle East conflict and where will it end. So much of the news cycle, of course, over the last 6 or 9 months has really been taken up with coronavirus, hasn't it? And that's really dominated the news cycle. And yet there are what would otherwise be headline news any other time of the year or any other time, really, has sort of dropped off the radar to a certain extent. So we're just going to have a quick refresher in case you've forgotten that despite the virus, the Middle East has been a scene of conflict ever since oil was discovered there, back after World War I. And in fact, it's got its own Wikipedia page, so you know that it's been going on for a while when that's the case. So what are some of the current Middle East conflicts? And we're going to look a little bit closer at some of these, but here's a list of them, current ones, as listed by Wikipedia. So going from most recently started, we've got the Iraqi insurgency, from which started back in 2017, so we've got about 5,000 dead from that. We've got clashes in Western Iran, which started back in 2016, and just remember these are just the current ones, not the ones that have been, finished, as it were. Clashes in Western Iran, which started back in 2016, there's about 150 dead from that. We've got a civil war in Yemen, started back in 2015, 50,000 plus dead from that. We've got the Saudi-Iranian proxy conflict, so this issue between the Sunni and the Shia Muslim, the two big powers of those two different sects of the Muslim religion, and they fight these wars on other people's soil mostly, particularly in Lebanon and Syria, which started back in 2011. We've got the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011, and there's up to 470,000 dead from that. We've got the Israeli-Iranian proxy conflict, so in case just Saudi Arabia and Iran wasn't enough, we've also got Israel fighting wars with Iran, again not necessarily out in the open. We've got the conflict between Fatah and Hamas, so that's the two branches of the Palestinians, Fatah mostly ruling in the West Bank and Hamas ruling down in the Gaza Strip. So that's started in 2006 roughly, 600 odd dead from that. We've got the Saudi Arabian Islamic insurgency, which started way back in 1995, which sort of bubbles along in the background, 300 odd dead from that. We've got the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, started way back in 1978, 100,000 plus dead from that. And we've got the Israeli-Arab conflict, which started as soon as Israel was sort of proclaimed a nation way back in 1948, and 84,000 plus dead from that over several pretty significant wars. So they're just the current Middle East conflicts that are sort of bubbling along in the background that we might have lost track of a little bit because coronavirus is taking up all the news space. So we just want to have a look at a few of these a little more closely before we turn our attention to Joel 3 and see how this is all going to sort of play out. So Lebanon's been, that has made the headlines because of that huge explosion that happened at their port, but there's been protests, there's been civil unrest going on in Lebanon since October 2019, and that has been called the October Revolution in Lebanon. And it was sparked by rising taxes on fuel and tobacco, but effectively also because of the sort of endemic political corruption in the country of Lebanon. Which has been obviously a long-standing problem. So Lebanon's basically been in a state of crisis for almost 12 months now, since October 2019. Now that huge explosion that did happen, that did actually make it to the sort of front page of the papers, that occurred a month ago, back on the 4th of August 2020, which was poorly stored ammonium nitrate explosives, which was in turn confiscated cargo from a Russian ship way back in 2014. It's just been sitting in the port since then, and that idea that it's just been sitting there, poorly stored, an explosion literally waiting to happen, it's really seen by the population of Lebanon as symptomatic of the corruption that is in Lebanon and in Lebanon politics and the civil service there. And that explosion really saw the protests in Lebanon increase, and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet resigned about 6 days after the explosion. So Lebanon's definitely in a state of flux, and it's always been, or for a long time, since the 1970s or 80s, it's been in this state of flux because of the different religions and different political interests there. Often the point of those proxy wars fought between Syria, Iran, Israel, and such like, backing different power groups in Lebanon. Yemen also undergoing a civil war, a literal civil war at the moment. That began way back in 2015. So Yemen's civil war has been going on for about 5 years now. And that happened when the Supreme Revolutionary Committee, representing a group of people called the Houthis, they overthrew the Hadi government back in March 2015. So over 5 years that's been going on for. Now, in turn, the Saudi government tries to prop up the Hadi government, which is sort of fled from the capital city. And on the other hand, we've got Iran supporting the Houthis. So this is really part of that proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So currently the Hadis control that light pink area that you can see on the map on the left-hand side there, and the Houthis control the green area. And of course, just in case that wasn't confusing enough, there's also a yellow area on the map, which includes the capital of Aden, which is controlled by the Southern Transitional Council, who are supported by, in turn, the United Arab Emirates, UAE. And they're claiming independence from Yemen generally. So there's three main groups fighting in this Yemeni civil war. Now, about 100,000 plus people have died in this conflict from the war itself, plus about 85,000 are dying from, or have died from, famine resulting from the war. So it's a pretty desperate, pretty terrible situation that's happening down in Yemen. Now this area is obviously particularly interesting to us because, as we'll mention later, it's part of the sort of Sheba and Dedan area that's mentioned in Ezekiel 38. But yeah, pretty awful situation going on down in Yemen at the moment. We've got protests in Iran as well. So this began way back, well not way back, but back in November 2019. And again, response to the economic hardship and government corruption, sort of tale of many governments in this area. And it's not just the students that are revolting this time, but the general populace, as opposed to previous sort of protests in Iran. Of course, Iran suffered under sanctions from the USA and the EU, and that's really seen inflation spiral out of control in that country. And it's estimated that an additional 1.6 million Iranians fell below the poverty line in 2019 alone. So again, a fairly desperate situation for a lot of the people in Iran. The Revolutionary Guard, who are the people who threw out the Shah and brought in religious rule in Iran, the Revolutionary Guard are seen now to have sort of excess privileges, and including exemption from some taxes, and that's really obviously put the general populace offside there. And in addition to all this, for 2020, of course, COVID-19 seems to be running rampant in Iran as well, and they're 12th on the list of total cases for countries in the world at the moment. Government responses to these reprisals was pretty swift and pretty severe, and about 1,500 protesters estimated to have been killed so far, and many more detained. So again, a bit of a conflict area in the Middle East. Not only that, but of course Iran faces the world as well. And again, our emphasis on Iran is because they get mentioned specifically as Persia in Ezekiel 38, as we'll see. But sanctions, the sanctions that we mentioned from the US and the EU were imposed to try and restrict the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. And there was an agreement reached under President Obama, you might remember, in the US, but that agreement was then torn up when Trump came to power. So as a result, Iran's got all this economic hardship, but they're trying to, they say, develop nuclear power as a future source of power. And just very recently, Iran has granted the UN nuclear watchdog access to two key sites they haven't granted them access to before. And really, they want to obviously get the sanctions lifted somewhat. But it's interesting that this has sort of forced a closer relationship between Iran and Russia, and Iran and Europe, and driven them further apart from the US, the Saudis and Israel. And we can sort of see the nations sort of lining up as we'd expect, as per the listing in Ezekiel 38 there. So Iran getting pushed closer to Russia and Europe, and getting pushed further away from the US, Saudi Arabia and Israel. So interesting to see what's happening in Iran, and that's all pretty recent, this new deal they're sort of starting to broker with the UN nuclear watchdog. Then, of course, we've got the ongoing battle between Israel and Palestine. Palestine, who claims, Israel is sort of occupying their territory illegally. But there's been a sort of uneasy truce between the two countries. The Palestinians had been sending over sort of party balloons with incendiary devices and bombs attached to them. They've been sort of using this tactic to annoy the Israelis since February this year. So that's not a celebration that you can see there, well, not at this stage. But they're actually setting up these gas canisters to go over the border, which they go on helium balloons and send over to Israel and try and explode them over there. So the Palestinians obviously are protesting the border blockades that Israel's put in place. And Israel sort of let it go for a while because they weren't doing a huge amount of damage, and no doubt everyone's sort of preoccupied with looking after coronavirus victims. But they did start responding in August. They started bombing the Gaza Strip, and about 5 days ago they sent tanks in to hit Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip as well. So remember, Hamas rules the Gaza Strip, so they're the people in power down there. But very recently, about a few days ago, we'll go with, in the West Bank, the Palestinians a lot more, currently at least, conciliatory towards Israel, and Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank is ready to negotiate with Israel through mediators, including the USA. So, as it says there from that quote from Newsweek, the Palestinian Authority president has expressed his readiness to return to peace talks with Israel, mediated by the European Union, Russia, the United Nations and the United States, which has aligned itself exceptionally closely with Israel in recent years. So President Trump might not be perhaps the brightest ever president of the White House, and perhaps because of that, he's been a strong supporter of Israel's, reversing that sort of cooler relationship that seems to have happened under Obama. So will there be peace between Israel and Palestine? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but Joel 38 and Ezekiel 38 and Joel 3 sort of perhaps suggest that maybe that will eventuate. So they're moving in that direction at the moment. Similarly, by way of contrast to all the conflicts that are in the Middle East, peace has broken out between Israel and the UAE here. So you can see a picture there of President Trump clapping, probably himself, at the signing of the peace agreement between the UAE and Israel. And again, Ezekiel 38 suggests Sheba and Dedan will be supporters of Israel, and the UAE is part of that general area of Sheba and Dedan down the eastern end of the Arabian Peninsula. So this peace deal was brokered by the US, and Israel agreed by way of a sort of recompense to halt their annexations in the West Bank for the time being. So they've slowed them down or halted them altogether. And of course, once again, the UAE are wanting to counter the power of Iran and the Shiite states, the Sunni Muslims. So they're sort of forming a bloc to counter the power of Iran by making this peace deal with Israel. What about in Syria? Well, that's sort of down to a simmer, I guess, these days. But Russia has been supporting, as we know, the Assad regime in Syria since September 2015 in the Syrian civil war. So prior to Russia coming in, it seemed almost inevitable that Assad's regime would fall, but get toppled by the civil war. But Russia came in firstly with airstrikes and then with ground troops, and the tide of the war really turned in Assad's favour. So out of this, of course, Assad has won greatly with Russia's support. His regime's got propped up for a little bit longer. And Russia's also won out of this deal, of course, because they get a Mediterranean port at Tartus. They get to undermine the US influence in the Middle East. And they, as the sort of the Gog being the prince of Rosh in Ezekiel 38 primarily, have got a big role to play in that area in the future, as we'll see. So it's interesting from a historical perspective to see Israel's sort of next invader just north of them, literally on their northern border, where down through history the invaders of Israel and Judah have come from: Assyria, Babylon, the Greeks and the Romans. So Syria's sort of simmered down a little bit. They're still in the middle of a civil war, but it's definitely turned in Assad's favour now with Putin's support. So let's have our attention turn to Ezekiel chapter 38. Now, Brother Phil Bell assures me that an excellent lecture was done on this very recently, and that everyone is sort of completely competent on it. So tonight I thought we might look at the same ideas, not from Ezekiel 38, but from Joel chapter 3. So Ezekiel 38 is going to be assumed knowledge for this lecture. But just in case any vital information was missed, we're going to do a brief recap. So if you turn back to Ezekiel 38, and we'll just try and pull out the key points from that chapter, which I'm sure was adequately covered. So in verse 2, we have this person called Gog who heads up an army assembled by him. And we've got the idea of Gog being chiefly the prince of Russia in verse 2. So that's where his main power base is from. But he's also associated with a couple of other countries, Meshech and Tubal, which get mentioned in verse 2 and verse 3 as well. But along with this, we're in the sort of political, geopolitical sphere, we've got other countries allied with Rosh, with Russia, in this invasion of Israel, and they get listed in verse 5 and 6 particularly. We've got Persia and Ethiopia and Libya, Gomer in verse 6, the house of Togarmah in the north quarters and all his bands. So these other people, allied countries with Russia in this invasion. And the key verse is verse 8, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to invade Israel. After many days thou, that is Israel, shall be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. Sorry, this verse is referring to Gog, leading up this invasion. Against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but which is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. So this is the point of the invasion. They're going to invade this new found country of Israel. And on the other side, we're going to have them questioned by, in verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions thereof in verse 13 of Ezekiel 38. So they're going to have this sort of opposition to this invading force headed up by Gog. And then finally in verse 18 through to verse 23, we've got God fighting against these invaders. So God steps in and prevents them from overwhelming the nation of Israel. So we've got a sort of a map with the key players mentioned in Ezekiel 38. So we've got Tarshish being the Western powers, particularly Britain and allied powers. We've got Western, Central and Eastern Europe all mentioned with Gomer, Magog, Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. We've got Togarmah in Turkey, we've got Persia being sort of modern Iran, Iraq, Libya in northern Africa, and Ethiopia in northern and eastern Africa as well. So most of those countries come down, the countries in red, opposed to Israel to invade, and Israel gets some support from countries such as Tarshish, Dedan and Sheba. So they get opposed somewhat weakly, it seems, from Ezekiel 38 by UK, Western, USA probably, Commonwealth countries, and Sheba and Dedan. So that's why we sort of looked at a few of the issues going on down in the Arabian Peninsula, because that's where historically they're from. So countries down in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Arab Emirates and such like. So that's Ezekiel 38. So Ezekiel 38 is a fantastic chapter because it lists out for us all the main players involved in this battle that's going to occur in the Middle East. Are we in the same territory, in the same area of prophecy though? That's what we need to confirm. So there's a few key sections of Ezekiel 38 and Joel chapter 3 which show to us that we are actually talking about the same event, that same invasion of Israel that we expect to happen and was prophesied by both the prophets. Is it the same event? Well, you just need to note the similar language and the similar symbols used in the three examples we've got there. So Ezekiel 38 and verse 8 talks about the land, this invading force coming against the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. So it's against Israel, and Israel has recently been brought back into their land from whence they've been driven for hundreds of years. Joel chapter 3, similar language in verse 1, for in those days and in that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. So similar time frame, which we'll look at shortly as well. So it's the idea that this is going to happen when Israel, the Jewish people, are reconstituted a nation in the area of Judah and particularly the city of Jerusalem. Ezekiel 38 verse 12 talks about the idea that Gog's coming down to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn their hand on the desolate places that are now inhabited and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations. So again, this idea of the Jews being regathered out of lots of different countries into their own country. Verse 2 of Joel chapter 3 has similar ideas. I will gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and will plead with them there for my people and my heritage Israel, whom they had scattered among the nations and parted my land. Verse 18 and 19 of Ezekiel 38 talks about when God does intervene in this battle. At the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord Yahweh, that my fury shall come up in my face, through my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. And again, this idea of God, voicing his anger. Verse 16 of Joel 3, the Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake, but the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So we've got very similar language. We've got very similar timing of the prophecies, as we'll see shortly, and a very similar outcome of this battle, this invasion that's going to take place. So I don't think there's too much doubt that we are in the same territory, we're in the same area of prophecy in Joel chapter 3 as we were in Ezekiel chapter 38. So timing obviously is the key for both of these prophecies. Joel chapter 3 talks about the idea of Israel being brought back, or Judah being brought back from dispersion, Judah being the one half of the nation back in BC times. So back in Joel chapter 3, we've got Judah, Israel being back from dispersion in verse 1. In that time, as we've read, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. So it's not just the Jews being back in their land, which we now call Israel, but also Jerusalem. So it's important that the Jews have occupation of the city of Jerusalem. So this is reasonably recent history, which is why we know that Joel chapter 3 is going to be fulfilled sort of in our lifetime, so in modern times rather than ancient times, primarily. So the Jews were given a homeland back in Israel. It was re-established after World War II in 1948. But it wasn't until 1967 that they actually had some occupation of the city of Jerusalem itself, and that took place in the Six-Day War. So Jerusalem wasn't the sort of Jewish capital, or the capital of Israel, when the nation was re-established back in 1948. It was still in Jordanian hands back then, but it was taken from the Jordanians almost 20 years later in the Six-Day War of 1967. So this timing is really critical, and the Jews' restoration back to their land, and particularly back to the city of Jerusalem, is a key to us pinpointing exactly when this is going to occur. So what does happen with this invasion? What can we learn about it from Joel chapter 3 that perhaps we haven't seen from Ezekiel 38? Well, you'll notice a phrase that got mentioned a couple of times in Joel chapter 3 as Shem was reading it. So verse 9, for example, proclaim this among the Gentiles, prepare war. This idea of waking up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. And that gets repeated again in verse 12. Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. So the idea almost seems to be as though the nations, the warriors, the people of war in the nations generally have been asleep, because God says it's time to wake them up. And again in verse 10 as well, so this idea of beating your ploughshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears, let the weak say I'm strong. It almost seems to indicate that the world's industries have gone more towards agriculture, and suddenly they've got to convert them to weapons of war. So it's interesting that Joel 3 has this similar sort of emphasis that Ezekiel 38 also has. So you might remember from Ezekiel 38 in verse 8, it talks about Israel dwelling safely, all of them. In chapter 38 of Ezekiel in verse 11, it talks about Israel dwelling as a land of unwalled villages, them that are rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. A real emphasis there on peace being in the land of Israel when this invasion takes place. And again in verse 14 of Ezekiel 38, in that day when my people Israel dwelleth safely, God says. So there's perhaps the suggestion in Joel chapter 3, as there is in Ezekiel 38, that perhaps there is a period of peace before this invasion takes place. So there's quite the emphasis on peace. There's a sudden waking up of all the men of war in Joel chapter 3, just as there's this emphasis on Israel dwelling in peace in Ezekiel chapter 38. So perhaps there's this emphasis on peace coming to the Middle East before this great and final sort of conflict that our title suggests. And that's why I think these peace overtures between Israel and the UAE, for example, or Israel and Egypt, or Israel and the Saudis, or Israel and the Palestinians, are so interesting, especially between the Palestinians and Israel. And it'll be particularly interesting if it's brokered by the EU and Russia being involved as well. And hence there would be the big surprise in Ezekiel 38, are you come to take a spoil? You sort of arrange this peace deal between Israel and Palestine, yet here you are sweeping down to take a spoil. Is that why you've come down? So it will be interesting to see what happens with that, with the advancing peace between particularly Israel and the other Arab nations surrounding them going forward. You might remember the words of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, which we won't look up now, but again, Paul tells us there that you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night, For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So again, the idea of peace and safety perhaps coming or being there, the warriors being asleep, as it were, only to be woken up by this invasion from the north led by Russia. So will conflict perhaps cease in the Middle East, only for world war to suddenly break out to the surprise of lots of onlookers? Where does this big battle in Joel chapter 3 that we read about take place, and who's involved? So once again, we've got the idea, we've seen already in Ezekiel 38, of all nations being involved. So Ezekiel 38 lists nations from almost beyond the then known world, and we've got similar ideas of all nations being involved here in Joel chapter 3. So have a look at verse 2, for example. Verse 2 mentions, "I'll gather all nations and will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat." Verse 9 talks about, "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles." So the Gentiles are the non-Jewish nations, so all the other nations apart from Israel. And it's going to be amongst the Jewish nations that war is going to be proclaimed. Verse 11 talks about, "Assemble yourselves and come, all ye heathen," not just some of the countries, but all the heathen, all the nations around Israel. And again in verse 12, "Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat." So this idea that a broad range of nations, if not all those ones mentioned in Ezekiel 38, spanning pretty much all the continents of the earth, it's probably no exaggeration to say that this coming conflict will affect every country on the earth in some way, even if they're not directly sending troops. But that the fallout of it will definitely affect every country on earth. And where does it happen? Well, a couple of times in Joel chapter 3, this valley of Jehoshaphat gets mentioned. So in verse 2, "I'll bring all these nations down into the valley of Jehoshaphat." And then again in verse 12, "Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat." Now, that's a tricky place to find because this is the only time it gets mentioned in the Bible. But you'll notice it also gets called the Valley of Decision in verse 14, "Multitudes, multitudes in the Valley of Decision," and then at the end of that verse, "in the Valley of Decision" again. And that links us to Revelation chapter 16. We're not going to go there tonight though. But this is the only time this Valley of Jehoshaphat's mentioned in the Bible. Now Jehoshaphat, if you're unaware, was one of Judah's sort of most famous kings, and he was famous particularly for being victorious in a battle without lifting a finger. It was a battle fought by an army of civilians led by a choir really, and God did all the fighting for them. And interestingly, the opposition to Judah in those days, they fell upon themselves and killed each other, exactly what God describes in Ezekiel 38, where each man's sword will be against his brother. So it's good reason for God to reference back to this king, Jehoshaphat of Israel, and you can read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. So it's thought that perhaps this valley is the valley of Berekah, which was near Tekoa, which I've got marked in red on the map there, which is not too far outside Jerusalem. Other commentators think that it's the Kidron Valley, which is right next to Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Either way, it's a valley that's right near Jerusalem, if not right next door to it, or it's a valley within the confines of the country of Israel, of Judah, because that's where Jehoshaphat ruled. And Israel, as you know, is not a particularly big nation anyway. But it seems likely that it's in that area very close to Jerusalem, if not right next door to it, that all these nations will be brought into this valley and the battle will be centred, focused there. But as you've seen in Ezekiel 38, when all these nations come up to war, Israel is almost overwhelmed, and then God intervenes. So in Joel chapter 3, that intervention from God is described in verse 16 and 17. "The Lord also shall roar out of Zion and shall utter his voice from Jerusalem." So Zion's a part of Jerusalem, Mount Zion. "And the heavens and the earth shall shake, but the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So shall ye know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then shall Jerusalem be holy, and there shall no strangers pass through her any more." So again, just like in Ezekiel 38, once all the nations have been dragged into this conflict, then God intervenes to save his people, the Jewish people. Just as they are about to be obliterated, then God acts and acts to save them. How does he do this? Well, it seems, as we saw from the example of Jehoshaphat, that perhaps the armies start fighting against each other and kill one another. There will no doubt be natural consequences as well. And the other point of similarity that you might remember between Joel 3 and Ezekiel 38 was this great earthquake that happens and gets mentioned in both chapters. So in Ezekiel 38 verse 19 and 20, God says, "For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel." And in verse 20, "So that the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the heaven and the beasts of the field and all the creeping things that creep upon the earth and all the men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground." So that's from Ezekiel 38, 19 to 20. Joel chapter 3 verse 16, very similar words. "The heavens and the earth shall shake when God roars out of Zion." So the idea of there being a great earthquake and a great shaking, it's really a very persistent theme among the prophecies about this great battle. And I've got another quote there from Zechariah chapter 14 that also describes, or partly describes this battle as well, which again we're not going to turn to, but it describes this earthquake in pretty clear detail. And in Zechariah 14 verse 4 it says, "And his feet," and we believe this is talking about the Lord Jesus Christ's feet as he returns back to the earth, "shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the west, towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall remove towards the north, and half towards the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake." So again, this idea of an earthquake, not just this mountain splitting. "Flee before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee." So God's intervention again is mentioned here. But also this idea of an earthquake. Now, earthquakes in the Bible can either be literal or symbolic, so often they're used as symbols of political or economic or religious systems all getting turned upside down. That's a very common use of this idea of the symbol of an earthquake in the Bible. But the language in Zechariah chapter 14 really does suggest that it's going to be a literal earthquake that happens, a very big one. With the Mount of Olives splitting a long way apart. So the language of Zechariah tends to indicate that it is actually going to be a literal earthquake that occurs in this time, and part of God's intervention and part of the effect on all the nations of the earth is going to be this massive earthquake that occurs as described in Ezekiel 38 and Joel 3 and Zechariah 14. So not only a symbolic earthquake with the nations of the earth being turned upside down politically and economically, but also a literal earthquake which will produce the same result. So once God has intervened, then Jerusalem, instead of being the centre of great conflict, suddenly becomes the centre of peace. So Joel chapter 3 and verse 20 says that Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. So no matter what the nations of the earth bring against it, after this huge conflict comes peace. And that peace is going to be centred, as Joel describes here in verse 20, in Jerusalem. And this battle is going to see, as we saw from Zechariah 14, the return of Jesus Christ back to the earth and the establishment of God's kingdom on the earth, ruled by Christ from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is going to be his capital city. And a final quote from Isaiah chapter 2 really describes exactly how this is going to occur. And as we read through this, just note the hints of Joel chapter 3, or the reversal of what happens in Joel chapter 3 here in Isaiah chapter 2. So In Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2 it says, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge," that is Christ, "will judge as king among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." So again, we've got these ideas that we saw in Joel chapter 3 of all nations coming to Jerusalem. But at this time, it's not to wage war. Now it's to come to worship the God of Israel. In Joel chapter 3, we saw plowshares being turned into swords. But of course, now in Isaiah chapter 2, swords are being turned back into plowshares. So no longer is there a need for weapons of war. We're going to convert them back into tools for agriculture. So Isaiah chapter 2 really sees the reversal of what we saw in Joel chapter 3. Instead of becoming a focus of the conflict in the Middle East, Jerusalem is going to become a centre of peace. And this really is the hope of the Bible. And the ultimate end of the Middle East conflict, instead of peace being the major, instead of conflict being the major export from Jerusalem, it's going to become peace, and it's going to become the centre of peace. And it's there that the conflict of the Middle East will cease.